In 1976 I purchased a Lima HO scale CIE Supertrain for the pricely sum of £10. It was the first Irish liveried model I ever owned, and it was to become my favourite model train for a number of years. In this video I want to consider how it would have fared against the competition of the time, and also how would it fare against today's competition. Let's take a look. Okay, welcome to today's review. So what are we going to do today? First we're going to take a look at the model itself, what was in the box, take a look at the different component parts and how they would fare up, I suppose, against the equivalent today. We'll then do a running session and get a feel for how this locomotive and coaches actually works in practice. After that we'll take a look at the summary scores for the model, and we'll do a scoring as it would be in 1976 against what the competition of the time would have been. And then we'll do a scoring based on today's competition and consider how this particular model fares out. So here she is in all her glory. The box is a little bit tattered, but the model itself is in full working condition. It's spent 30 years in my attic and hence got a little bit of damage and dampness on the outside of the box. But the coaches and locomotive and the power supply and the track are all fine. And we'll get a look at this guy running on the layout in a few minutes. So opening up the box, what do we get? So first of all we have the locomotive based on a Class 33 British Rail, just liveried in the CIE Supertrain livery. There's no working lights, there's no DCC obviously, but this was actually a very good running locomotive, certainly superior to any of the Hornbys I had at the time. Very fast locomotive, very good performing locomotive on dirty track, and overall I really enjoyed this particular locomotive in its day, and it's a credit to Lima, I think, in terms of the motors that they had in these locomotives. They were definitely, I would say, superior to their Hornby equivalents at the time. The livery is what it is. It's a reasonably faithful representative of the CIE Supertrain livery. Obviously the locomotive isn't, but still I think this for a young modeler at the time, this was the best you could get, and I was certainly well pleased with it. One thing of note on these locomotives and the rolling stock is the couplers, and Lima had this distinctive coupling type at the time, which the hook and loop format of coupler. This is more or less gone from these days. You only see it on some DMUs. I've seen it on the more recent Mark IIIs from Hornby, and it is an extremely reliable coupler, particularly when you're running models at speed and if you want to run models in reverse as well as pulling forward. I think the current tension lock couplers do not work well when you're pushing against them. They work better in tension, which is what they're intended to be. They don't work well under compression, whereas these particular hooks, I found them very, very reliable, and it is sad that they aren't being used more frequently today, because I think they actually looked pretty good, and they do give very good performance, particularly when you're running coaches at high speed, and I think that's the reason that Hornby have recently added them to their Mark IIIs. Certainly the recent Intercity Mark IIIs do have the option of these particular couplers with an M pocket so that you can swap them out. So I always found those quite good. You did have to mix them if you had Hornby stock. Obviously you were just hooking onto these, which was less than ideal, but still I found them as good, and I would rate them highly. So going back to our box, let's take a look at the next item we had here, which is the coaches. These were based off a Mark II stock, British Rail Mark II, again painted up in the CIE Supertrain livery, and they were, I suppose, reasonably representative. The CIE Supertrain coaches at the time would have been based off Mark II coach types as well, and so these were, as far as I was concerned, they were as good as you could get at the time, and I was well pleased with them as rolling stock for this particular train. So no complaints. I was very, very happy with these. The other items in the box is the power supply and the actual loop of track. So they give you a standard circle of track. It's actually less than radius 1, which might seem pretty incredible. Quite a tight turn on these particular tracks, which meant they could occupy a very small space, so you could fit your loop of track into a very small space. And anybody who's familiar with with the Lima track. It was a pretty good track, pretty good connections on it, and didn't really give any problems, and does work reasonably well in connecting with the Hornby track. The sleepers are different, but apart from that, it did connect up quite well, so it was quite easy to mix the track with Hornby track. The power supply itself was a very strong power supply, give good power to the track, and as I said, this one over 40 years old now and still functioning, and still delivering all the performance that you'd expect. The usual short circuit control in there, so it does a cutout on a short circuit. So overall, very pleased with the engineering from Lima for both the power supply and the overall set as a whole. I think it's a credit. This is, over 40 years old, as I say, and it still looks and functions extremely well. Okay, I think the next thing we need to do is actually take a look at this particular set running out on the layout. So we'll shift over to that now and see how she performs. Okay, we're going to see how this kind of performs on the layout now. So I'm running it on my inner circuit, which is a DC circuit, radius 1 track, and obviously this locomotive in stock doesn't have any problems on radius 1, considering they were running on an even tighter radius with the Lima track. Running it at a kind of a medium speed, didn't want to risk any derailment. As I said, this locomotive is a flyer and really runs very, very well. And I suppose it's running here after over 40 years since it was purchased, and 30 of those years were spent in a box in a damp attic. So I think that's kind of testimony to the engineering from Lima, that this is pretty well running out of the box without any servicing or anything. So I've always found it a good runner. The only thing is you just need to watch as I said, the higher speed. It's a relatively light locomotive, hence that risk of derailment on a tight bend. And when you start running very long rakes, you start running into problems in terms of grip, and again, that's a consequence of being such a light locomotive. But overall, very good performing, and very good performing over things like points and diamonds and things like that. And the locomotives I would have had from Hornby at the time would have been relatively sluggish. They would have had problems with dirty track. They would have had problems with points. Not uncommon that you've got to reach across the layout and kind of give them a push. I never had that with this particular locomotive, and hence it was always a favourite. I would always like running this because I didn't have those kind of problems with it. Hope this running session gave you a feel for this particular model. It was a great model, and it still is here today. Okay, let's take a look at a summary. We've been reviewing the Lima 5516 CIE Supertrain. It's a HO scale model in the orange and black Irish CIE Supertrain livery. It comes with a DC locomotive modelled on the BR Class 33, but painted in the Supertrain livery, and 3 Mark II coaches. Comes with a DC power supply and a circle of sub-radius 1 track. It is DC only. There was never an option for DCC. DCC didn't even exist in this time frame. Extra features, I suppose, the radius of the track to allow it to run in a very small area. You could run it on a small dining table, for example, and the very nice Lima and couplers, which were very reliable. And I think best of all is the selling price. This thing sold, and I purchased it for £10 in 1976, and even by today's standards at £68, that's extremely good value. If you think about it, it's not much more than the cost of a Murphy Models Mark II coach, and yet you're getting a full train set for that with the locomotive and power supply, etc. So really good value, and even if we had an equivalent today, it would be fantastic value. Now the scoring, and this first scoring is 1976 scoring, so against the competition of 1976, which I was familiar with, because I had a number of other locomotives and rolling stock at the time. I'd say performance-wise, this was pretty well my best performing locomotive. Very reliable on the track, very fast, too fast actually, because this on the very tight sub-radius 1 bends, it would derail at top speeds, absolutely no problem. Very light locomotive, so it would literally fly off the edge of the table, and that happened to me on more than one occasion. So but really good performance, and reliable performance to this day, as we saw in the running session. I think the appearance was pretty good, and in its day it would have been certainly very good from an Irish modeller's perspective. We didn't have a lot of options in 1976, and this was as nearly as good as you'll get in that time period, so giving it a good score there. There was no sound option, obviously. Extra features were kind of pretty limited. Packaging was fine, very much the same as what you'd get at the day. As I said, the value I thought was 5-star, really good value for what you got in the box. And overall, a 4.5 star, and I highly recommend it. So in 1976, this was a very nice set to have, and I think I was very pleased with it. I think these sold out very quickly. It was in HO scale. They did versions in OO scale a couple of years later, as Lima moved into OO scale pretty well just after this period. And as we know, they've been great patrons of Irish modelling in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and a lot of very good models have come from Lima in that time frame. So this was a really good model in its day, and it really was a standout for the price. So coming to today, the performance as a DC locomotive is actually still pretty good, and it would still fare up well against, typical DC locomotives. Railroad locomotives from Hornby, for example, which would be equivalent in terms of their body weight and level of detail. Appearance is not as good. I suppose our standards on appearance would have gone up. We've been spoilt with the Murphy models and Lima locomotives that have come since. So from an Irish modelling perspective, but I'm still giving it a reasonable 3-star. It is, for the price, I think it is still pretty good. Again, the extra features, there is very little in the context of today. No lighting, for example. Packaging documentation, really wasn't very little documentation, as you'd expect a little bit more now. But the value was still there. At £68, this would still be a compelling starter set. And hence, that's my recommendation. It scores, I'm giving it an overall 3.5 stars. But would be recommended as a starter set. If we could purchase such sets today, I think these would be very popular. Very expensive for somebody to get into Irish railway modelling today as a youngster, and a set like this would be a fantastic entry level. So if only someone would produce it. But I think the cost structures are such that this could be quite a challenge in modern day times. So in summary, I hope you enjoyed this review. I think this set really is a standout. It's a credit to Lima, their engineering, the fact that this set has survived, I suppose, a lot of very heavy running and usage when I had it. Absolutely no breakage on the set, despite all that derailment and flying off the edge of tables. And this locomotive, as I said, did treat me to a lot of that when I had it, and I did have to be careful until I got some Radius 2 or Radius 3 track, which pretty well stopped the derailment. But really good value set, great fun set to have, a great starter, and as I said, a credit to Lima. And I think we probably have missed Lima. They have been great patrons, as I said, of Irish modelling. In collaboration with Paddy Murphy. I think they've given us some fantastic models. It's sad to see them gone, and really this just brings back the memories, which was really, this was probably the start of Lima's really strong period of time in the 80s and 90s, which were really probably the peak of their powers, and they delivered a lot of very good models in those days, and we still see them on eBay, and they're still running. So all credit to Lima. Sorry that you're not there anymore, but we still have the legacy and the memories. So what did you think? Did you own any Lima models? Did you own this particular set in the past? And if you did, what were your thoughts? Do you still have it? Please put your comments below. That would be great to get your feedback. So I hope you enjoyed this. It's a journey into the past, but I think an interesting one, a little bit of a sentimental one, I suppose, for me, but a very interesting one with regard to, I suppose, the level of engineering and innovation that was in Lima at the time, and all credit to them. This was a great little set, and would still be a great little set today if we were able to buy it. Okay, thanks for watching today, and hope to see you on a video in the near future, and in the meantime, happy modelling.